Bueno, muy buenas noches, bienvenidos a Casa Árabe. Esta conferencia la hemos nombrado la debacle de Irak y con unos interrogantes, unidad, federalismo, califato o partición. Con el comienzo de los despertares o las llamadas primaveras, revueltas, en fin, una serie de sinónimos regionales en 2011, la capacidad de los estados-nación para recuperarse y sus instituciones son puestas a prueba diariamente. Mientras la integridad territorial de los distintos países del Oriente Medio y Norte de África es sometida a múltiples presiones, existe el riesgo de que las fronteras se modifiquen en la región, el frecuentemente citado fin de Sykes-Picot. Un claro ejemplo es la aparición y consolidación de Estado Islámico, y deliberadamente digo Estado Islámico y no el Estado Islámico, o Daesh, por su acrónimo en árabe. Su alcance y su estrategia de reclutamiento, sus recursos y su capacidad de organización que han sorprendido a la mayoría de actores y observadores en Oriente Medio. Esto no solo en Siria, sino claramente en Irak. Irak, laboratorio del cambio de régimen y la democratización forzada desde el derrocamiento de Saddam Hussein, ha sufrido una división de facto entre al menos dos tipos de actores. El Kurdistán en el norte, gobernado por el gobierno regional de Kurdistán, GRK, por sus siglas, o KRG, y el resto del país, oficialmente regido por el gobierno central iraquí, mientras que las provincias son sometidas a las dinámicas locales, ya sea políticas o sectarias, dinámicas que pueden ser centrífugas y cuyos resultados pueden ser desastrosos. Con la proliferación de actores no estatales y su naturaleza múltiple, desde las tribus hasta los grupos radicales, es indispensable entonces revisar y cuestionar el análisis tradicional centrado en las instituciones del país. Precisamente estos actores no estatales cada día ejercen una mayor influencia y muchas veces un puñado de personas puede, digamos, causar gran daño a la construcción nacional de un país. Parece que ahora hemos entrado en una nueva era en la que tanto la descentralización y el federalismo tienen que ser considerados como parte de las soluciones para garantizar la estabilidad y evitar el desmembramiento potencial de los estados-nación. Y sea cual sea la solución que se requiera para Irak, sin duda involucrará a los actores regionales e internacionales. Hemos dedicado aquí en Casa Árabe toda la jornada de hoy al seminario internacional Irak en la encrucijada, Irak at a Crossroads, organizado por Casa Árabe, la Fundación Friedrich Ebert y el think tank FRIDE. Hemos elegido de los 12 expertos que estaban aquí presentes hablando justamente del futuro de Irak a 3 de ellos. Nos acompañan esta noche entonces Miriam Benrad, investigadora del Centre d'études et de recherche en relations internationales, el Centro de Estudios y de Investigación en Relaciones Internacionales de París, Sciences Po. Kawa Hassan, investigador de HIVOS y del Carnegie Middle East Centre. Y Mohammad Ali Shabani, investigador de la Universidad de SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. Vamos entonces a escuchar las ponencias de estos 3 ponentes y después pasaremos a un debate y al turno de preguntas. Y bienvenidos a todos, al embajador de Irak, muy buenas tardes. Empezamos por Miriam, gracias.
Good evening. So thank you, Karim, for this very nice invitation. I'm pleased to be here, and I wanted to speak French, but I was forbidden to do so. So I'll speak in English tonight. I would like to reflect on the Islamic State, taking as an angle of reflection, analysis, the question you're raising in this conference, the question of federalism, devolution, decentralization, partition. We're hearing a lot these terms. We've been hearing them for quite some time now, which more or less all refer to the profound recomposition of the Iraqi state, and more generally, as Syria has slipped into a full-blown civil war, and also with other, as you know, troubles ongoing in the region, and not only in the Middle East, but also, of course, in North Africa, with Libya being also in a state of chaos, and other countries having gone through a number of troubles associated with political transitions. I would like to reflect on this recomposition through the offensive of the Islamic State, and how this offensive and the recent developments in Iraq, which of course also affect a country like Syria and more broadly the region, to what extent these developments point to a profound, as I said, recomposition of the Middle East order as we've known it over the last century, and which is actually which goes much further, in my view, than the recent period, the Nouri al-Maliki years from 2006 until this year. Of course, the legacy of the American occupation. I'd like to also bring some elements of history that, in my view, also explains to many, in many regards, the state of decomposition in which Iraq finds itself today, and by extension, as I said, other states. So the first lieu commun or cliché that has surrounded the Islamic State was, in my view, the notion of novelty that was associated to the group and this offensive that was spectacular in Mosul last June. The Islamic State is by no means a novelty, a new group in the insurgent landscape of Iraq. It's a group that first appeared in 2006, and which is itself the result not only of the occupation. When it was proclaimed in October 2006, it was the direct product of the Al-Qaeda, the Iraqi branch of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But beyond that, if you look at the sociology of the group, and in particular the figure of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, you will find out that this group is also in many ways the direct product of what was before, which was decades of authoritarian power, which also, and I think it's a very important point to make, contributed to the emergence of this the Salafist jihadist generation that has taken the leadership of the group. Baghdadi himself was a Salafist preacher in Baghdad in the 90s, and benefited from the relative opening of the regime towards Salafist circles following the Gulf War under the sanctions, since Saddam used both the tribes at the time and also the most radical religious circles as means for himself to legitimize a regime that had been in a state of crisis, beyond the statements of victory that had characterized the end of the Iraq War and the Gulf War. There has been under the Ba'athist regime a very vicious and continued dynamic of national deconstruction, since behind the facade of a nationalist discourse and nationalist construction, Iraq used to present itself as the vanguard of Arab nationalism. Many sectors of Iraqi society remained on the margin and went through very brutal repression, as you know. Of course, the Kurds, since the creation of the Iraqi state under the British mandate in 1921, and later on politicized Shia circles, which themselves were sidelined and considered, and it's very clear in the rhetoric that the regime used to employ, were sidelined and designated as adversaries of the nation. This national deconstruction goes further than that, was exacerbated, as I said, by years of wars. This actually started with the war against Iran and was radicalized with the Gulf War and the sanctions. I think the embargo also played a very important role in disintegrating the Iraqi society and what remained of a national feeling or sense of belonging among Iraqis. And this is extremely important because the argument of the artificiality of Iraq as a nation state and of the Middle East itself comes back now very regularly in the debate. I don't think that such a historicizing or very essentialist view is the right one. I think that this decomposition process has to be seen and addressed as, again, as a dynamic, as a process inscribed in contemporary history, and which, in my view, although Iraq had gone through a number of political turmoil and very unstable phases before the arrival of the Baathists, the seizure of power by the Baathists, I think the authoritarian period that, again, the Saddam Hussein regime exacerbated and incarnated to the extent that certain experts even saw in this regime a sort of a new form of totalitarianism. I think this is a really important aspect to understand also why Iraq today finds itself in such a state of disintegration. The American occupation has not helped things since the whole, for quite understandable reasons, at least on the side of the former political opposition. The whole reordering of Iraq was based, as you know, on ethnic and sectarian lines, with a new government that was formed, the first post-Baathist government that was formed along ethno-sectarian lines, along quotas, without having any firm statistics, and which actually consecrated two categories that were not very familiar to the Arab political culture. The first notion was the notion of the majority. So the democracy actually that the United States promoted was by no means, and I think it's an important point to make, a democracy based on political programs or on a real genuine political debate, which a lot of Iraqis were actually asking for, but directly on these notions of the majority substituting itself to the power of minority. This has alienated partly the Sunnis, who themselves had been overrepresented in the administrations, in the army, in most institutions. This was the case actually since the Ottoman Empire. The British had just more or less perpetuated this scheme. And so they found themselves in this situation of being labeled as a minority, sidelined, since more or less collectively associated with the Baathist regime. And so from the very first weeks of this occupation, the victory of the new Iraqi Democrats, namely Shia and Kurds, for most of them coming back from exile to govern on the ruins of the regime, had as a symmetry a marginalization of the Sunni population that actually became a continuous pattern of the Iraqi transition. The insurgency in which the Islamic State has taken its roots is now has now several years of age. It all started in 2003, as of actually the first weeks following the fall of the regime, with a number of different groups, different actors, and the rapid deterioration on the ground, on the military level, actually favored very quickly the most radical part of this insurgency, namely the Salafists. Some of them, as I said, being Iraqis, radicalized generally in the 90s, others being Arabs, and also, of course, already under the American occupation, number of foreign jihadists attracted by the Iraqi battle against the United States. This ascent of the Salafist jihadist trend was really clear in 2005, following the two battles of Fallujah, which is a very important city, since the offensive of 2014 actually started in Fallujah before it started in Mosul in June. It even more precisely started in December 2013. This is not hazard. It's 10 years after these two battles of Fallujah, which saw at the time the destruction of the city, with the most brutal combats in fighting between Iraqi insurgents and the American army. And these battles were really perceived by a lot of Sunnis, even those not living in the Al-Anbar province, which is the western province of Iraq, in which Fallujah is situated. This was really a moment of humiliation for a lot of Sunnis, who later boycotted the first elections and never really managed to come back into the political process, despite a number of attempts, despite a number of parties, like the Muslim Brothers, for instance, trying to take part in the different governments and trying to propose an alternative. This has never really worked. And the humiliation and the resentment associated to it became the leading pattern of this Sunni experience in post-Ba'athist Iraq. And 2014 is, in my view, an important date, and the Islamic State is very attached to dates. It actually takes place 10 years after the Fallujah episode. And this offensive is seen and presented in communiques published by the Islamic State as the moment of revenge, which not many expected, but which is still very symbolic, given, as I said, that the whole thing starts in Fallujah last January. Regarding Mosul, Mosul was actually occupied by the jihadists before the assault was given in early June. Mosul is a conservative city. It's been confronting the central government, and especially the government of former Prime Minister al-Maliki, for a number of years. And this very tense environment, the resentment of the local population against Iraqi security forces, the Iraqi army, and more generally a transition seen as illegitimate and the product of a foreign occupation, was never accepted, which offered fertile ground to the Islamic State to develop its message and to really do literally lobbying to convince the population that the state it was proposing was the only true and credible alternative to, as I said, a transition that had been illegitimate, and also to a state controlled, dominated after 2003 by the former Shia opponents to Saddam, and of course being oppressive, authoritarian, since a number of crackdowns were also launched by the former prime minister in the city. So the environment was actually very favorable, and the advance of the jihadists, as we've seen, was spectacular, but at the same time quite natural, considering that the population had given up on the idea of a dialogue with the central government and was actually now embracing this revolutionary idea of a state that would be completely new and that could actually reveal itself much more promising than staying under the sway of a state, as I said, oppressive, authoritarian, and offering no perspectives. So in this regard, I really think that, again, there's no spectacular character in the territorial progression that was achieved by the Islamic State. It was actually very easy. Also, a number of jihadists are themselves sons of these cities, of these regions. The Islamic State is not a sort of alien group. It's actually deeply ingrained in the local environment. It's present among the populations. It also benefited from the support of a number of tribes, imams, supporting the idea of this political, this totally new political project. This is, of course, if one looks at Iraq and if we look at the issue of partition, which has also been quasi omnipresent in the debate over Iraq in the last years, we are actually in the context of a secessionist project which negates the national borders. It negates the borders of Iraq, but it also negates, of course, the borders of Syria. The interesting thing being that these borders, national borders, are actually qualified in the written production of the Islamic State as garbage of the West, as the product of a colonial partition, which is the direct cause of the decline of Arabs. So in the view of the jihadists, nationalism is the enemy. It's the main cause of the Arab decline in the 20th century. And the remedy is, of course, the return to what was before, which is pan-Islamism, the Muslim solidarity, and, of course, the return to the caliphate, which was the governing mode of the region for several centuries. And this message resonates with quite significant credibility among populations, as I said, who have been given no alternative, no hope. There is a deep sense of disenfranchisement and alienation, as I said, since 2003 among the Sunnis, who for most in June, let's put it, embraced the project, or at least chose to bet on this project, at least temporarily. Of course, the policy that was almost immediately applied by the jihadists, and you probably have seen how life was organized. The combatants distributed a number of leaflets with a number of injunctions given to the population. I'm not going to come back on the mass crimes committed by the group, on the fact that no form of opposition is tolerated, and has also pushed a number of people to leave, at least those who are not ready to submit to the group. But originally, and even though now there's a strong sense of deception among Sunni populations, given the fact that their life has not improved and that this Islamic State is actually finally as oppressive as the Iraqi state had been before. Despite that, I think, again, it's still important to emphasize the fact that the message was strong enough to rally, and still remains strong enough to rally, in the absence of an alternative discourse, and in the absence of a government that really engages in a dialogue with the right actors. We're hearing, and this is a point I made this morning, a lot about inclusivity, power sharing. We're actually in the context of a quasi-existential struggle for the control of the state, be it the existing state or the state that has been unilaterally proclaimed by the jihadists. So now where are we? I will finish on this. Where are we today? And I'm focusing on the Sunni context, the Sunni regions in which this Islamic State is. There's a beginning of mobilization against the jihadists, which is still very difficult. Some tribes have taken up arms with the cooperation of the American forces, which, as you know, have re-engaged on the Iraqi battlefield lately. We are also witnessing a beginning of dissent or a beginning of rejection of the Islamic State within the Sunni regions themselves, with the multiplication of acts of defiance, people basically choosing to leave for all the reasons I mentioned, the brutality of the group, the executions, the terror that is now basically the norm in terms of socio-political life. But it's very difficult because, as I said, no real option is offered by the central government. The Sunni leadership itself is very weak. The Sunnis are very divided. The tribes themselves, which the United States is trying to engage with, are extremely divided and have very different visions of the battle and of what comes next. And this is where we're touching upon the question of what is the post-ISIS scenario. And this is an interesting and actually fundamental point, because it's quite unlikely actually that following this turning point, Iraq will go back to a re-centralized state. Federalism is actually recognized by the constitution, was never really implemented for a number of conflicts around the definition of this federalism and the sharing of powers and prerogatives. And of course, the oil rent also plays a role in this. But we are definitely going towards at least forms of devolution in the context of a failed state, of a central government that will have a lot of difficulty to re-legitimize itself and re-attract towards itself the Sunnis. The question being, can we go towards a Sunni autonomy, according to which lines? It's not actually sure that this would be the solution, given, as I said, the intra-Sunni divides and divergences. Now, the question of partition, we've discussed this also today during the seminar that we had. The partition has been on the table for a while. It's not also a given in terms of pacification and stabilization of what is still called Iraq. So my conclusion is that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible at the moment, to really know where we're going. But one thing that seems to me quite sure at this stage is that we're not going to see the Middle East go back to where it was, since also the crisis of the centralized state has something to do directly with the collapse of authoritarianism, or at least the deep crisis of authoritarianism as we've known it in the Arab region for some time. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Miriam, por esta participación. Gracias también por el esfuerzo por hablar inglés. Nos encantaría que hablaras francés, pero no tenemos tantas posibilidades de interpretación. Gracias por también dejar en claro que momentos como el de Fallujah fueron determinantes, que hay muchas veces justamente batallas y luchas que terminan, digamos, determinando el camino que toman justamente ciertas provincias. Ha hecho Miriam un análisis sobre todo de las provincias suníes de Irak, que es el objeto de su investigación, pero ha planteado una serie de cuestiones como la legitimidad del Estado, como el proceso político desde 2003 tomó un camino que dejó fuera a varios actores importantes, entonces un proceso político excluyente, y esto ha determinado justamente ahora la configuración y la aparición de actores no estatales. Por ello, Estado Islámico es, aunque se quiera ver como una causa de división, muchas veces realmente es la consecuencia, no es lo que estábamos concluyendo algunos de los ponentes esta mañana, que hay que ver justamente de dónde viene Estado Islámico, la evolución que tiene y cómo no es simplemente algo que ocurrió un día, sino que es la consecuencia de varios fracasos. Quisiera dar la palabra ahora a Kawa Hassan, que nos hablará más de la dimensión kurda. Habíamos pensado en unos 15 minutos por ponente. Miriam ha tomado 20, entonces lo justo es que si quieres tomar 20, los tengas. Gracias, Kawa.
Thank you very much, Karim. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. And once again, I would also like thank Casa Árabe and my colleague Karim for inviting me to talk about the Kurdish dimension of future prospects of Iraq. I share the analysis of Miriam about that the previous political order in Iraq failed during Saddam Hussein, but unfortunately post-Saddam Hussein order also failed. So we have dealing with two failures. Saddam Hussein regime was characterized by an overly centralized regime, political order, which oppressed Shiites and Kurds, but also Sunnis, those who were opposed to Saddam Hussein. And the wars against Iran, Kuwait invasion, and after that the sanctions, the two other wars transformed the Iraqi society and radicalized also some segments of the Sunnis in the 90s, led to radicalization of some segments of the Ba'ath Party, which I think the origin of the Islamic State lies there in the 90s, because Saddam Hussein waged a huge religionization campaign. It's called Al-Hamla al-Imani al-Uzma, the great religious campaign, which paved the way for the current radicalization of some segments of the Sunnis. So that was a failed state. The post-colonial state was a failed state. But unfortunately, those who came to power after in 2003, they also failed to produce an Iraqi state with which all Iraqis identify themselves as citizens. To clarify this, I mean, the budget, the Iraqi budget for 2014 is $140 billion, 140 billion, and it has not yet been approved by the parliament. And now we are in December 2014. I don't know where that money is. So this gives you an idea about the chronic failure of the state, of the post-Saddam state. Now, talking about the Kurdish dimension of future Iraq, for those who are familiar with Iraqi Kurdistan, and for those also who are not familiar, if you ask any Kurd, whether in Iraq or Iran or Syria or Turkey, what do you want? You will get one clear-cut, crystal, unequivocal answer. We want independence. That's what we want. We are a different ethnic group. We are entitled to statehood. Of course, for diplomatic reasons, maybe politicians will not say that, but that will not change the reality on the ground. But there are some serious obstacles to arrive there, to have a Kurdish state. After the fall of Mosul on the 10th of June, between the fall of Mosul on the 10th of June and the ISIS attack on Mount Sinjar on the 3rd of August, the rhetoric of independence was dominating the Kurdish politics in Iraqi Kurdistan. And it was mainly initiated by Kurdistan Democratic Party of current President Masoud Barzani. And back then and now, I was very critical of that rhetoric because I don't think it was realistic for a lot of reasons which I'll mention. First of all, to establish a state, you need some preconditions. You can't just like that establish a state. What you need first and foremost is, particularly in a divided society, is you need to have absolute 100% political and social consensus across all political and social groups. And secondly, you need an economic independence. I mean, you need to be economically independent. And thirdly, you need to be also militarily independent. These preconditions are not there yet in Kurdistan region, which does not mean that they will not be there in the future, right? But for the moment, they are not there. And I'll explain why they are not there. Well, first and foremost about the consensus. Despite the fact that Kurdistan region has been autonomous since 1991, and Kurdistan region has had its own parliament and its own administration since then, Kurdish political groups are actually very fragmented. They are very fragmented between different political groups and between different ideas, perspectives about the future of the region. When the idea of independence was initiated by Kurdistan Democratic Party in June, July, it didn't have the support of other parties, and KDP was accused by other parties that it single-handedly initiated this idea in order to enhance the position of KDP within the political landscape in Iraqi Kurdistan. There are serious divisions and disagreements between the two main parties, Kurdistan Democratic Party of President Barzani and Patriotic Union of Kurdistan of former President of Iraq, Talabani, about the future of the region. And KDP of President Barzani has strong strategic relations with Turkey, with Saudi Arabia, with Gulf countries, and also with Iraqi Sunni groups. PUK, on the contrary, has very strong strategic relations with Iran, is a strategic partner of Iran, has strong strategic relations with Iraqi Shiites. And you have a third political party, Goran in Kurdistan, which is trying to balance the positions, but it's very difficult to hold an independent position in a very polarized region. And then you have PKK. PKK has emerged as a very strong player after the attack on Mount Sinjar. It was, the fighters of KDP withdrew from Mount Sinjar, and it was PKK who rescued the Yazidis, came from Syria. So this has led also to tensions between KDP and PKK, and the majority of Kurds in Iraq right now actually see PKK as the only party which is capable of fighting ISIS, because it has proved that it can fight against ISIS in Kobani, in Ain al-Arab, in Syria, but also in Mount Sinjar. So this has led also to enhanced tensions between these two groups. Now I will come to the issue of economic independence. Iraqi Kurdistan is an rentier region, as we call it in political science. It means its economy is dependent on oil revenues, just like Iraq. Almost 96% of the budget of Iraq derives from oil revenues. And the same applies to Kurdistan. When there are ups and downs in prices of oil, as it is the case right now, that has huge impact on the budget. And that's what we are seeing right now in Iraq. I mean, Iraqi federal government is actually financially bankrupt. It has no money. Maliki left a bankrupt Ministry of Finance for Abadi. And Iraqi Kurdistan faces also huge economic crisis, mainly because of the disputes with Maliki, who decided in the beginning of this year to withhold the budget allocation for Kurdistan. So what you're seeing in Kurdistan is that civil servants get their salaries like, they get the salary of June in August or in September, because Baghdad refused to give the money to Kurdistan region. And more importantly, Iraqi Kurdistan is actually economically very much dependent on Turkey. In the last 10 years, there has been an economic development, economic boom in Iraqi Kurdistan compared to the rest of Iraq. And this economic boom was the result of oil revenues and foreign investments in Iraqi Kurdistan. Turkey is the biggest investor in Iraqi Kurdistan. It has over 1,500 companies in Iraqi Kurdistan. And Turkey benefited a lot from investing in the oil and gas sector, in real estate sector. Kurds also benefited from that, but mainly the ruling elites benefited from that, and not the majority of populations. So this economic boom led to extravagant social inequalities between a very tiny minority and an excluded majority. So there is, Kurdistan region is economically very much dependent on Iraq, on Iran, on Turkey. Just to give you an idea how dependent is Kurdistan. I need just to give some figures. It almost imports 80% of its goods from neighboring countries. Food, everything, almost all stuff have been imported from Turkey, from Iran, and from Iraq. And almost between 70 to 80% of the budget of Iraqi Kurdistan is spent on paying the salaries and pensions of civil servants. We talk about 1,400,000 civil servants, of which only actually half are real civil servants, and the rest have been appointed because of their political connections to the both ruling parties, right? So for its economic survival, Iraqi Kurdistan is still dependent on the neighboring countries on Baghdad. Now, militarily, also Iraqi Kurdistan is dependent on US, on European countries, but also on money from Baghdad. We have seen that Peshmerga didn't manage to push ISIS back in August. It was a big shock and shame for Kurds to see Peshmerga forces who were always, held in esteem, by Iraqi Kurds. They didn't manage to put a fight against ISIS. And they are unequipped. They have to get money from Baghdad, which refuses to give that. And they were untrained. They were not really tested for the last 10 years in battles against, other combatant troops. So militarily is actually dependent on US in particular. Had it not been for US interventions and Iranian interventions back in August, probably even Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, would have been overrun by ISIS. And this is a bitter reality. This brings me to the idea, to the question of the prospects of Kurdistan. Will it become an independent? Will it remain part of Iraq? As I said, the majority of Kurds, all Kurds actually want independence. But for the time being, there are no foundations of state in Iraqi Kurdistan. And in my analysis, it would be much better for Iraqi Kurdistan to attempt to reach lasting solutions with Baghdad on oil revenues, on budget allocations, on disputed territories between Kurdistan region and federal government, and also on finalizing the demarcation of borders of Kurdistan within Iraq. Should this fail, which could be the case, then Kurdistan can go for the option of independence, but before doing that, it should work on, and this is mainly the responsibility of the two ruling parties, they have to reach consensus with other political and social groups in Kurdistan. They have to build the foundations of independent economy and independent military. And without these foundations, going for independence right now would be a political suicide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kawa. Muchas gracias. Como decía Kawa, una serie de fracasos que venían desde la época de Saddam Hussein, una serie también de factores que han transformado a la sociedad iraquí y bueno, particularmente es interesante seguir el desarrollo del gobierno regional de Kurdistán, que por una parte parecería ser una de las regiones autónomas más, digamos, exitosas en cuanto a su desarrollo económico y sin embargo también enfrenta serios retos, como nos decía, la dependencia de sus países vecinos con relación a todas las importaciones que tiene que hacer o bueno, el peso de todos estos empleados del gobierno sumamente inflados y en el que se va 70% del presupuesto del país. Vamos a pasar a Mohammad Ali Shabani, que justamente trata los temas cercanos a Irán. Irán, que desde luego es uno de los actores hoy por hoy más importantes en Irak, cuya influencia es innegable. Y bueno, justamente en el seminario de esta mañana se habló con detalle del papel de Irán y justamente de la injerencia que tiene también en los asuntos internos de Irak. Mohammad Ali, por favor.
Thank you, Karim, for the invitation here in Casa Árabe. It's a pleasure to be here today. I think the previous speakers have been talking about very detailed aspects of federalism or partition of Iraq. And what I want to do is to zoom out a little bit and see the big picture here, put Iraq in comparison with other cases, and also point out the many difficulties that arise in terms of partition. And here I'm also going to talk a little bit about the different responses from regional powers, which builds on what you said about Turkey, for example. First of all, in general, the usual argument about partition is that once you have ethnic or sectarian fighting and enough blood has been shed, you can never put things back together. It has to be partition. And that this is the only way to end this cycle of violence, which is usually based on identity. But looking at a wider set of data, in a statistical sense, it becomes clear that this is not the case. According to a recent study published by the journal Foreign Affairs, since 1945, out of 180 civil wars which have been studied, out of which half were either ethnic or sectarian, only 14 to 24 partitions were the outcome. So that's about 10%. When comparing those cases to conflicts that did not end with any kind of partition, no evidence was found that partitions prevent the recurrence of war. So the data simply doesn't support the view that partitions are a good solution to ethnic or sectarian civil wars. There are many aspects of the latter to consider. First of all, in the case of partition, what usually happens in most of the cases is that the allied factions which have formed a new state turn on each other. We've seen this most recently, for example, in 2011 in South Sudan, which seceded from Sudan. You see the situation there now. If you're not familiar with the situation, all of the parties, the ethnic groups that rose up against the government in Khartoum are not fighting each other. And this is the world's newest state. This is number one. If you want to take that experience in Sudan, South Sudan, to Iraq, we can look at the Kurdistan region. just 20 years ago. And today the Kurdistan region is the most stable region of Iraq. It's the most economically viable, in terms of successful, in terms of progress since 2003. Yet 20 years ago, it was a civil war there. The two biggest factions in Kurdistan were fighting each other in the 90s. There were tanks against each other being used. So we should keep this in mind. And now with the Kurdish seizure of the disputed oil city of Kirkuk, which has many different populations. It has Arab population, it has a Kurdish population, and Turkmen population. If this area is kept in a new Kurdish state, what will happen is that these ethnic minorities will be imported into a new Iraqi independent Kurdish state formed out of Iraqi Kurdistan. The question is then what to do with these sizable Arab minorities within the new Kurdish state. Will Kurdistan have to resort to ethnic cleansing? How will it deal with these new citizens which are non-Kurdish? And this defeats the whole purpose of having a purely ethnic state based in Kurdistan. So this is something to consider. In the Sunni regions of Iraq, we have a configuration of different forces right now, which are made up of tribal fighters, of members of the former regime, which are cooperating under the umbrella of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, which is the main terrorist group operating in Iraq and Syria right now. It's called ISIS. They have something in common now because they all share the common goal of detesting the government in Baghdad right now. This is the common goal. But as soon as you have an independent Sunni stand, so to speak, these factions will have nothing in common. In the worst case scenario, you might end up with a state where ISIS, a group like ISIS, is dominant. That's a total nightmare for everybody, for Iraqi Kurdistan, which might be independent, for the Shias in the south, for all regional countries, and for the West. And also even within a Shia state, the most likely scenario would be that the militias that are fighting alongside the Iraqi security forces right now, but the Iraqi security forces today being already majority Shiite, will turn on each other. So you have immediate conflict between them. From another aspect, you will have very deepened anxieties and fears among the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. The Gulf Cooperation Council is a faction made up of 6 different countries on the Arabian Peninsula, the biggest of which is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia will not be very happy about an independent Shia Arab state in southern Iraq, and consider that the south of Iraq is where 90% of Iraq's oil exports go through, not Iraqi Kurdistan, southern Iraq. So if you have an independent southern Arab Shia state with a huge amount of oil resources and huge level of oil sales, and it's very much financially viable, that has a lot of anxieties which will pale in comparison to the anxieties already present in Riyadh due to what's happening in Iraq, where you have a Shia majority government in power in Baghdad. Conversely, I think Iran, which is also Shia majority, would also be worried about a Shia Islamist Arab state in the south of Iraq. It would provide an alternative model of governance. That's number one. Number two, just across the border from the south of Iraq, where actually most of Iran's oil reserves are located, Iran has a sizable ethnic Arab minority. In the 1980s, Saddam, when he invaded Iran, he banked on these ethnic Arabs to rise up against Tehran, to fight on Iraq's side. That was a miscalculation by him. But Saddam was Saddam. He was secular Sunni Arab dictator. If you have a situation where you have a Shia Islamist Arab state based, say, in Basra, what guarantee does Iran have that this new state, which will be awash with oil wealth, huge amount of development, will not be attractive to Arabs on the other side of the border? For example, in the southern Iran right now, according to the law, 2% of Iran's total oil wealth, oil export earnings, have to be returned to that province. Even though this money is returned to that province, that's a faction, considering that 99% of the oil is coming from there and they're getting no development compared to what's happening, for example, in Tehran. So this is a very double-edged sword. You have both the Saudis anxious about what might happen and Iran on the other side. Even if a new state might be stable, there's no guarantee of that there'll be security elsewhere. We have the cases of Somalia. Somalia was ruled by a dictator, Siad Barre, until the 1990s, and once he passed away, we all saw what happened: total breakdown in order, the destruction of the state. And what has come out of that old Somalia traditional Somalia. Today, for example, we can see Puntland and Somaliland, which are two statelets made up of former Somalia, which are relatively stable. But then when you look at the rest of Somalia, it's still chaos there. There's no functioning government there. And if you want to look in the case of Iraq, what we saw in June and July when ISIS, the terrorist group ISIS, was entering the second largest city in Iraq, Mosul, the initial Kurdish response was that this is an Arab problem. This is a problem for Baghdad. This is not a problem for Erbil. So there was no response whatsoever to the onslaught of ISIS. Just weeks later, the capital of the Kurdish region, Erbil, which Kawa just mentioned as well, was within the reach of ISIS. It was almost overthrown, almost taken by ISIS. So the belief that you can have stability in your own region and pretend like what's happening on your doorstep doesn't concern you is not a long-term approach, a very realistic approach. And this is something to consider. Again, there's also the issue of basic finance, as Kawa mentioned. According to the current legislation, Iraqi Kurdistan is entitled to 17% of Iraq's oil revenues. That's much more than what it would get under current circumstances, where it would export whatever it has through Turkey, for example. This is assuming that in case it declares independence, Turkey will not step in and say, we're going to shut the border. We're going to continue cooperating with you. So the question, what incentive will Turkey have to continue its cooperation with an independent Iraqi Kurdistan, considering its own sizable ethnic Kurdish minority? And second of all, Iraqi Kurdistan would not be able to finance itself under any current circumstances, even if the Turkish border was open. On the other side, we have the south of Iraq, which I mentioned earlier, and through which 90% of Iraq's oil exports go. Imagine a situation where you have the south of Iraq with 90% of the oil revenues, 90% of 140 billion seceding. The rest of Iraq would not be viable. So there's a lot of factors to consider here, to do with finance and to do with the basic economics of a state. When you do have examples of somewhat successful partitions, although bloody, you can look at, for example, Pakistan and Bangladesh, which divided in the early 1970s. It was bloody, but they succeeded in that in the end. But what helped was that there was a huge state stuck between them. We have India right between them. They couldn't physically attack each other in that sense. And in many other cases where you have successful partition, there's always been an external guarantor of security, of the new status quo. Who will be the guarantor of the new status quo in partitioned Iraq? Will it be the United States? Will it be Iran? Who would be willing to take on that responsibility? The way I see the situation, I don't believe neither the US nor Iran would be willing to step in to uphold the status quo. I don't think that's not feasible in Washington right now, to own that problem. And lastly, I think that if you do have this partitioning of Iraq into 3 separate regions, or say 2 regions, naturally different states would want to maneuver against each other, and there would be obviously investment in different statelets in an attempt to turn them against each other or extract concessions or resources from them. So very easily these rivalries between the new statelets could expand and turn international, to sucking in more partners, kind of a bigger version of what you're seeing in Syria today, much, much worse. So that's also a nightmare scenario to keep in mind. So my bottom line is that in the case of Iraq today, I think that partition would likely create more problems than it would solve. Thank you.